of the presentations will focus also on evaluation, others focus on other aspects of the case studies. So each panelist has about 10 minutes to present, and then we'll have 2 minutes for specific questions to them. So write your questions in the chat, but then we'll have time to come back to questions and for general discussion at the end. So all of our panelists are industrial partners. It's associated with the SECLI-FIRM case studies. And the first one is Marco Formenton, who's a meteorologist with Enel in Italy. So he got his master's degree in physics in 2005 at the University of Rome Sapienza, and in 2009 obtained his PhD at the University of Genoa in cooperation with the Italian Institute of Atmospheric Research in Rome. His PhD work was mainly about the correlations between cloud microphysics and non-inductive electrification using numerical modeling and lightning data. In 2012, he moved to the University of Hawaii at Manoa, where he undertook postdoctoral work, studying the correlations between lightning and aerosol and working with a numerical model of cloud nucleation and non-inductive electrification processes. But today he's going to talk to us about weather and power utility in the context of one of the SECLI-FIRM case studies. So Marco, thanks for kicking off our panel presentations. Over to you.
Thank you, Claire. Thanks. So I'm going to share my screen or not. So, okay.
Okay, it's just coming now. I'll tell you when I can see it. Okay. Yeah.
Okay, can you see my screen?
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, perfect.
Okay, thank you very much. So we're going to have a short presentation about the typical problems of a power utility, and so the way how this problem is tried to overcome on this project. So let's start. Okay. So a general overview about the relationship between weather, power production, and power markets, and how they affect the business decision process. So the decision tree. So let's start with the basics. We are going to take an example of case study 1 that was an important heat wave occurred in Italy on July 2015. So the first problem is the power demand. So when the last years, when the air conditioning becomes to be used by many people, when we have a heat wave, we can have a peak of power consumption because of this cooling system. That is what happened in Italy on this period. We can see here the peak of power demand that is just above an average value for years, and so with a peak demand, we have a consequence over the power prices. And now we are trying to understand how they are related. And so the first effect is a physical effect. So the weather is very hot, so the demand of electricity becomes very high. And this is a basic law of economy. So the price of a good is the result of the ratio between the demand and the offer. When the demand is above the offer, the price tends to go up. Here you see just a cartoon. So when the demand, the supply exceeds the demand, the price tends to go down. So this is the opposite effect. So during the summer, when we have hot weather, the demand becomes very high, and so to create problems on the market. And we see there is a historical prices of electricity in Italy that normally is around 50 euros per megawatt per hour. And on July, it had a peak of about 70 euros. So we have a really high prices. And it's clear that if we be able to have a forecast of such prices, so basically a forecast of this such weather, we can have a clear advantage on the market. So this is a first example, quite obvious why we are interested on seasonal forecast, and so we enjoyed the project. The second problem is the production. So Enel in the last years moved strongly to renewable production because we trust in the clear production of energy. So we are trying to close all our coal and fossil production shortly. So renewable production is nice, but there is a problem that is difficult to predict. So you have to be able to predict. Mostly the main power source is still hydroelectric for renewable. There's about 40% of the whole renewable production in Italy. And it's very important for Enel that has a lot of power plants over the Alps and along this Apenninian, this a long chain, mountain chain in Italy. During 2015, we had a very long-lasting dry period. You see these NOAA reanalysis anomalies of precipitation over the last months of 2015. And that we had severe problems of power production, because if you have a lack of hydroelectric production, you have to cover this missing production by fossil, so by gas or by coal. And if the system has a shortage of power because of this drought, you can have a very high prices of coal, of gas, because all your competitors also are trying to cover the missing power by the same problem. So we have also to try to forecast properly precipitations and wind for the forecast of precipitation, the power supply. We have another additional problem of this, that's very super simple, that is when you make a contract with your customer, so this is a very simple example, these contracts are usually on the forward. So for example, now I can do a contract for a delivery of, I don't know, December. So when I sign a contract with a customer, I have a problem that at some point I have to deliver the energy. So the best situation is that I already have the electricity, so the production, so everything's fine, and then I'm able to deliver the product at the end of the contract. But usually, maybe I have no energy, or I have to make a plan for the energy. So I promised the energy, but I have to do something. So one thing is just to buy energy from the market, by a counterpart, months in advance, and then I will give this energy on my customer, or I buy energy on MGP, or for example, to use the hydroelectric dams as a reserve, for example. So if I have a good reserve system and I forecast normal precipitation, maybe I can take some safe water on my dams, and I will be able to run my power plant when I have to sell the electricity. So, or maybe if I forecast a dry season, I have to rush up and buy some coal or some gas in order to be able to run my fossil power plant when I have to deliver this electricity on December. So at the very end, you have a very complex and problem that can be reassumed in a decision tree. This was an important effort that we spent on the project to try to formalize the normal decision process in the corporation. So this is very simple, and usually the process is much, much more complex, but this is just an example that you have basically a multivariable problem. So you have the forecast problem, the actual management of the power plants problem, and you have the market problem. So you have also to take into account what is the situation in the market. In some situation, if the prices of commodities are low, maybe it's more convenient to buy the goods in the market. But when the prices are very high, already high, and you have to cover your promised production to the customer, you have maybe to go to make some complex actions or in the market, or if possible, on your power plants planning. So basically buy energy and then you have the energy, or maybe would be more, you can make more money just to leave the position open, so-called. So you expect, if you expect the market is going down, you just wait for buy a commodity at lower prices and increase your margin. So that's a part of the problem that starts from the weather forecast, so seasonal forecast. So at the beginning, you need to have a scenario by the weather, by the markets, also forecast of oil, I don't know, price of coal. Then you start this, actually this flow chart, so to take a decision. And that's basically in this, so what we have done in SECLI-FIRM is just to make two main fluxes, where one was the decision was taken using the normal average value, historical average values as forecast, and that's this the benchmark. And the test is using the seasonal forecast. So basically, we would like to do better than using normal values. And then we produced this performance indicator that is basically non-dimensional indicators of the performance of some parameters for the corporation. That basically is the margin, so the profit, that is quite obvious, but also the risk. So the main goal of a corporation is to reduce the risk. That is quite, I would say, more important to make profit. When you do a good job reducing your risk, I would say almost automatically you make money. So the really first problem is to reduce the risk. So to manage the risk, that cannot be zero, but you have to manage the risk. And so we basically use such indicator that we cannot show in the details for you know, I would say discriminant problems, but basically it's a measurement of performance of our ability to reduce the risk and to make better margins using all normal values as a forecast or seasonal models as a forecast system for the weather part of the problem. So I'm finished. Thank you. I hope that I have been clear. So now I'm open for questions.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Marco, and for that really nice real-world illustration of the importance of having timely seasonal forecast information, but also the importance of users like you thinking about the market and risk. So at the moment, I don't see any questions, but maybe we can come back to some questions for you in the panel discussion at the end. So if anyone does have any questions for Marco to either answer in chat or later on, please write them down. But let's move on to our next speaker, and let's learn a little bit more about hydropower from Valentina Cavadon. So Valentina is an engineer in the engineering and consulting department of Alperia Limited. Alperia is the main energy provider in South Tyrol in Italy. Alperia produces energy from renewable resources, manages the electricity grid, and sells electric energy in district heating systems. Valentina's been working in Alperia since 2013. She deals with hydroelectric systems and hydraulic structures. And she specialized in hydraulic and environmental engineering. Valentina graduated in 2008 from the University of Trento in Italy. And in 2012, she finished her PhD in the same institution in fluvial engineering. So Valentina, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Claire. I try to share my screen.
Okay.
Can you see it?
Yeah, if you just go into presentation mode and then you're all set to go. Yeah, perfect.
Thank you. Good afternoon to everyone. For the SECLI-FIRM project, I applied the case study 2 that Marco told you something before. Well, South Tyrol, we applied this case study in a small part of our region. Well, South Tyrol, where Alperia Ltd is working and is located, is in the northeast of Italy and is a very little province of Italy in the Alpine areas. And the valley where we applied the case study to is a valley in the southwest of the region, where a system of 6 hydropower plants in series is present. So it is a really complex system, and we consider this drought period between 2015 2016, and we analyzed in which way a forecast model can improve the management of a so complex system. So I would like to introduce you briefly some concepts about hydropower plants and hydropower production. It is used to differentiate two kinds of hydropower plants depending on how the energy is generated. We can have, as in this slide that you can see, the run river hydropower plants or some conventional hydropower plants. This, in the slide, is a scheme of a run river hydropower plants, and in this kind, generation depends on the quantity of water that you can take from upstream. It means that the rest, the oversupply, must pass unused. And in this kind of hydropower plant, you cannot really do a management of the production, but you have to take what you are able in that model. While in conventional hydropower plants, to the contrary, you can, in a certain extent, decide the production that you need. So in this way, you can generally you generally have a dam and a reservoir and an artificial basin. So in a conventional hydropower plant, you have a volume of water that you can store in the reservoir. It means that when you need to produce, you can decide the quantity, the production that you want to have in that moment, because you can maximize or minimize the production by changing the water discharge. In fact, the power in hydropower plant is the multiplication of the water density, the efficiency of the machines, the efficiency of turbines and generators, the water discharge and the water head. So to have a good forecast of the precipitations, as the SECLI-FIRM project aims to, means to know the available volume of water for production that you have in the next future, or in a larger period, in 6 months, for example. You can figure out what of yourself this kind of plant you can manage the production. You can decide every moment the production you need, and so a better forecast of the availability of the water volume in the reservoir in the future can help to optimize the management of the production and the trading in the energy market. Okay. In this slide, an example of a theoretical future management of the volume in a reservoir. In the figure, you have the comparison between the reality, the black line, that is the actual volume in a reservoir in the considered period, in this case, more or less 6 months, and 3 different curves obtained by a simulation. 3 different simulations in which 3 different hypotheses of input data are considered. How you can see in the first part of the period, the real volume contained in the reservoir is larger with respect to all the 3 run simulations. In the second part, the results of the 3 theoretical simulations are spread. So what does it mean? It means that with the best agreement between reality and forecast, we could manage in a better way the hydropower plant production. This slide contains an example of the summarized results, the final results that we obtain from the project during the SECLI-FIRM project. Here you have the comparison of the prediction of production considering 3 different initial hypotheses. The green bars are the real production in the system that I saw you before in that valley, in 6 hydropower plants. The black ones are the predicted production using the actual analysis that Alperia does. Alperia uses at the moment a model in which you can put some input data, as for example the availability of the water discharges from the basin, and so on. And the model gives us the optimized management for a certain period that we decide. While the yellow bars are the predicted production from by using as input data the data from the forecast of the SECLI-FIRM project. How you can see in this case, okay, a better forecast of the input data can give us a better agreement between the reality and the forecast, the predicting the production, and that is really useful for a correct management of the hydropower plants. This last slide, in the same way, you can see the differences between the forecast production, the predicted production, and the profits. It means that if we know which is the production that we can do in the future, we can also have a better idea of what is the gain that we have from the production, and in which way we can play with the energy market. So from the final results, I estimated that from a better forecast of the input data, we can obtain more or less some percentage of larger profit than in the actual condition. So I'm at the end if you have some questions.
Okay, thanks very much, Valentina, on that really interesting perspective from the real world of hydropower management. So I've got some questions for you here. The first one is from Dana, who asks, is the snow cover depletion inducing fluctuations in hydropower production and energy price?
Oh, yes, that's a very interesting question, because it's a really important point. Yes, we are in the Alpine areas, so it means that the larger production in a year, we do a larger production in the year during the summer period because of the snow cover, because of the volume of snow that we have in our mountains. In this case, well, for the SECLI-FIRM project, we had from URAC, from our researcher partners, we had the input data for our model. And these input data considered also this aspect, also the precipitation in during the winter period, that generally for us they mean production in the summer period. So yes, it's a very interesting point, a really important point.
Okay, the other questions are quite technical, and I think one of them might have already been answered by somebody else. One was about the minimum elevation difference used in order to produce energy. But that's a question from there.
The minimum difference used, it depends on the hydropower plant. I mean, if during the production, if we have in that period that we are considering the minimum level in the reservoir, we cannot produce, because we cannot take off water from the reservoir. But we can decide to reach that minimum in certain case. For example, when the prices of the energy is very high, so we can decide to produce all the water volume that we have available. But it depends on every hydropower plant and its characteristics.
Okay, thanks. So there are a number of other questions in chat for you, Valentina. But I suggest we move on to our next speaker. And some of them you might be able to reply in chat, but if not, we'll come back to them in the panel discussion at the end. So thanks very much, Valentina, for
thank you
for now. So now we're going to move from land and water. Well, we're sticking with water, but we're going offshore, so different kind of water, and looking at one of the SECLI-FIRM offshore maintenance case studies. So we're going to hear from John Upton, who's a senior metocean engineer with Shell. He gained his bachelor's and master's degree in Plymouth in the UK, and then worked for a world-leading oceanographic services company for 13 years. His roles included deploying instrumentation from vessels and oil and gas rigs in many harsh and challenging regions. I don't know, John, maybe you could talk about this instead of what we asked you to talk about. You've worked in the Arctic and the Falklands, Gulf of Mexico and the Far East. So during this time, John managed a team of oceanographers and held responsibility for tendering before leaving to join Shell in 2005. Most of his career in Shell has been supporting operational aspects of conventional oil and gas activities, although he was metocean engineer on a major capital project and has also held safety, contracting and training roles. So John, over to you.
Thank you, Claire. I could talk for a long time about lots of places that I have been, but we're not here to talk about that. I will share the presentation. You let me know. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we
Claire,
can
hear me okay?
We can see your slides, yeah.
So,
yeah, please go ahead.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you for the introduction. As Claire says, I'm working, have been working on a case study with the Met Office, and Joe referred to it earlier on in some of the evaluation work that he was talking about and engagement with end users and things like that. I want to talk in a little bit more detail about that, but not in too much detail, so feel free to post questions in chat. As Claire said, I've been working with Shell quite a long time. I'm now managing the site expertise team in the offshore, in Shell's floating offshore wind team based in France. We cover metocean wind and geoscience. But everything that we've been doing in the North Sea case study with the Met Office is actually applicable to what we do in offshore wind as well. So it's very valuable work that's been carried out. So what we were looking at, seasonal forecast improvement. Well, everybody knows that in winter, it's not a very good environment working in the North Sea. In the summer, it's a very good environment. So what we wanted to try and do was optimize working in the shoulder months. And when I say shoulder months, I'm talking about sort of March, April, end of the spring, and September, October, because those are the times when competition for resources is quite high. And any improvements in forecast horizons and confidence and skill that we can obtain beyond 3, 4, 5 days is actually very, very valuable. So that's what we were looking at, improvement of shoulder months weather forecasting. If you ask, or you wonder what operational planning is like in an offshore environment, whether it's in offshore wind, offshore oil and gas, or shipping, coastal work, it's probably fairly similar. And that is, at one end of the spectrum, you look at things like an exceedance table. So this is wind speed, and by month you have an exceedance. So you might have a working threshold of 15 meters per second. And a table like this just tells you, based on a long-term historical data set, how much uptime you're likely to get, or how much downtime in any one month. So you can see, obviously here, during the summer, conditions are workable. In the winter, it's not. And what we're looking at is these shoulder months. So that's one end of the planning spectrum. And then when you go through, we ramp this up and we do persistence analysis and weather windows analysis on the same data sets. And then when you get to, after you've done all your planning, you get to implementation and installation, you would rely very heavily on weather forecasts. Quite often these are safety critical activities, whether it's offloading from a vessel or carrying out critical activities on a platform that have weather limits. There's significantly high safety factors that are required. So you need to be very confident in weather forecasts. And that might mean that you limit your forecast horizon to 3 days, particularly in winter. And the limitation is not necessarily just on horizon, it could also be on the threshold. So you might bring down the threshold in conditions when you know that it's difficult to forecast. And as I say, this is particularly impactful in the shoulder months. I mentioned earlier competition for resources. You might want to quickly put in the chat box what you think these things are worth, but whether it's a vessel like this that's bottom right, that's a walk to work vessel, so this would dock alongside a platform or a monotower, put a bridge across, motion compensated bridge, and you'd be able to transfer goods and personnel on and off that platform. Here you've got a jack-up rig that's installing turbine blades on a nacelle. And here you've got a jack-up, so similar sort of structure to this, but it's lifted its legs and it's actually being transported by these 3 tugs. A vessel like this, probably of the order of $50,000 a day, a spread like this, upwards of $500,000 a day. So if you can improve your forecast horizon and your workability, then obviously you have an ability to significantly impact profitability of the business. It goes back to what Marco was saying earlier. It's all supply and demand. We have used vessels like these tugs to deploy instruments in the North Sea, wave buoys, things like that. And on one job I was working on, 1 week this vessel, exactly the same vessel, 1 week it was $15,000 a day, the next week it's $75,000 a day. That's just because demand, because of the weather window, demand increased significantly. So the owner was allowed to increase his price to whatever he wanted, basically. And the other limitation that we have is that we've got an ability, particularly in terms of planning beyond, there's a limitation on that ability to plan more than a week ahead. Sometimes we might use things like ensemble forecasts from the Met Office. So we have our climatology envelope and we run an ensemble forecast system that gives us a range of uncertainties in our forecast, and it gives us a slightly longer look ahead. We sometimes use teleconnections, so something like the NAO is potentially a useful index that we can use to see whether or not we're likely to experience mild, stormy weather or calm, cold weather. And really this drove, all of these points drove the planning for the question that we were asking ourselves at the beginning: how can we plan better and optimize our activities? So using this case study as a way of improving both our cost performance and the safety aspects of working offshore. The results of the study, Joe's mentioned a little bit about this. Decision tree was an important thing to develop early on, both in terms of understanding within the SECLI-FIRM group, but also giving us a tool to use with end users. Here we have a wind speed and a wave height threshold and a binary yes or a no-go type decision. Coming back into that, we have a seasonal forecast information that we're trying to use to improve our forecast horizon, and then that positions us at an advantage, either whether it's booking boats, scheduling teams, deciding where to work, whether we work in a sheltered location or an exposed location. And then we use that to improve the decision-making process based on the wind and wave conditions. If we've got a set of thresholds and it looks like it's workable, then we could look at the probability as well. So the probability of exceeding or not exceeding that threshold. And this builds on some of the work that we were doing before SECLI-FIRM with the Met Office on cost loss thresholds. And that's an important starting point for the process. We then came up with the Met Office. The Met Office came up with a forecast product. There were a number of iterations because also mentioned earlier is communication with the end users. How do we pitch something like this with end users who on one hand just need a go, no-go decision, but they also don't have a detailed understanding of metocean processes and a forecasting capabilities. So the top graphic here is what we ended up using. We actually took away a couple of these thresholds, so we just had one line that showed basically, are you above or below climatology? So are your conditions better or worse than you expect them to be at that time of year? The other three plots, the three graphics in that plot give us a way of looking in more detail at what might be driving that over or under exceedance of climatology. We also looked at the economic impact to see whether or not, as I mentioned earlier, vessel day rates can fluctuate wildly depending on whether or not there's a weather window and whether or not activity needs to be carried out offshore. So we wanted to use that to see whether we could quantify the economic benefit of improving the weather forecasts. And then there was a video graphic. We've mentioned communication with end users, and this was a SECLI-FIRM video graphic that if you haven't seen it, then there are a few of them on SECLI-FIRM's site. I'd encourage you to go and have a look because they're quite good short summaries of the process that we go through and the benefits that we can gain from this sort of process. Looking at the outcomes, and obviously we've got experience now working with a world-leading centre of excellence and the wider WMC team. And the partnership, it was a partnership, it was a two-way flow of information, us gaining technical expertise from the Met Office and WMC team, and us providing feedback either from myself or from end users. We trialled on 2 case studies actively, and we looked at another one in parallel. So the idea was that we would run our standard forecast product and our case study forecast product, and we looked at the differences between the two. We also were lucky enough to share experience with KNMI and with Thames Water. So it benefited us looking at the end products that they were coming up with, forecast products, and the process that they went through. So that was useful as a side outcome for SECLI-FIRM involvement. As I mentioned, we've got the decision tree to improve the process and help us help our stakeholders understand the process. We've got a forecast product that we actively used in August on a project in the southern North Sea, Dutch sector, in very shallow water, so that helped as well. And we started to look at the economic impact, and we've got some outputs to share with a wider audience to help them understand. So that was quite a quick run through. I hope I've given you an overview of where we are and what we've been doing, and I'm happy to answer questions. Thank you.
Okay, many thanks, John, for that great overview. And I have to say that it's been really fascinating and interesting for me watching how this case study has kind of evolved and developed over the course of SECLI-FIRM, and the linkages that you've made with some of the other case studies as well. So at this point, I can't see any immediate questions for you.
Okay.
But we'll get people to carry on writing, and we'll come back for some sort of general discussion. So unless anyone wants to raise their hand quickly. Okay, thanks again, John. We'll move on. We'll move back to land, and to water supply and management. And well, this is a double act that hopefully you'll remember from what, way back from session 1. Was it 2 weeks ago? So this is our colleagues Leo Kiernan and Ian Savage from Thames Water. And as before, I think, Leo, you're going to speak, and then Ian will come in with questions and in the panel discussion. So if you're all set to go, please share your screen.
Sure. Welcome, everyone. I hope you're enjoying your time in this summer school. So, confirm, can you see my screen? Excellent.
Yes, and I can hear you fine.
Thank you very much. Okay, so I'm going to be spending some time talking about, I'm not going to be talking about myself. I'm going to skip straight over that. But myself and Ian probably have 55 years worth of experience in trying to run the water system more efficiently or more safely or more robustly. And our case study in SECLI-FIRM was all around trying to understand what value could be added from climate services around water resource management, especially around periods of stress. And I'm going to spend some time talking about a for instance of how this service has added value this year during an event called the Freeze-Thaw event. I will unpack that as we carry on this presentation, and I'll also reflect on how the lockdown, the COVID lockdowns that happened all over the world, but also happened in the UK and London, compounded the potential risks associated with this event. And hopefully I'll end with some good news. So if I start with the water cycle, to try and give some context to the water industry, our business is down here, running across the bottom. So we take water from the environment and make sure that it's treated so that it's drinkable. So our water processes take raw water, turn it into potable water, and we can put some of that potable water into storage, into reservoirs, like big batteries, I suppose. And ultimately it ends up going to people, you and me, and industry, etc. And then we also take the waste away and process it such that it's of a good enough quality to be returned to the environment. But you can see here that we are heavily dependent on the weather for so many aspects of our business. And John and Marco both talked about supply and demand. We use those terms quite heavily. The supply is the supply of water, and the demand is the demand for water that is taken at people's houses. I'll unpack that again a little bit more as we go through the presentation. Slide, this material is available down here on this URL. So the structure of my presentation, I'm going to be talking about a situation which was a real threat to the water industry, and how understanding the nature of that threat helped us to see how the weather drove that threat, and how you could then take that and do some proactive management. Specifically, a weather situation called the Beast from the East, that was what it was labelled as in the UK, which caused very, very extreme cold weather and a load on our system, a shock to our system. And the SECLI-FIRM and these climate services have helped us understand how that shock manifests, why it manifests, and when it might be coming. So this is the edge. This is the hedging that Marco was talking about. So if I talk about a historic event, so these extreme cold weather events are quite rare. We've happened to have two or three in the last 10 years, but generally speaking, they're quite extreme and quite rare events. The worst that's happened in kind of recent memory was in the winter of 2017-18, and it caused some extremely cold weather, and a phenomenon happened to our network, which is a very rare phenomenon when this extreme weather happens. So to describe what this phenomenon is, we call it freeze thaw because that's the mechanism that goes on. And what happens is, under extreme cold conditions, water can freeze inside pipes, and they can create an ice plug which can actually break these pipes. The thaw part of it is when that ice plug melts and lets the water issue from the pipes. And this is a distributed phenomenon. It kind of happens in people's lofts, and it happens in pipes that are in car parks and things like that. And so it can happen at a large scale all over the network. So it's a quite dramatic event when it actually happens. And to finish the freeze thaw event, obviously then there's a recovery period where people realize that they have broken assets or broken pipes, and they go and repair them. So there's a time delay where this bad thing is happening to the network, where water is issuing in an uncontrolled way, and it takes time to resolve. And that time to resolve bit becomes material in lockdown. So if I show you a satellite map of what Europe looked like in March 2018, we were blanketed in extreme cold weather, snow, etc. It all come down from Siberia because of a weather phenomenon that is kind of well known. There was a breakdown of a vortex and sudden stratospheric warming, and we got cold weather, and then we got an extreme shift between cold and warm. And this set of pictures here is taken on the day. So this happened. It was very cold leading into March, and on Saturday, March 3rd, I think, everything warmed up. The temperature went from below zero to above zero, quite considerably above zero, in a few hours. All of this snow melted, and all of these ice plugs melted, and demand rose dramatically, and that caused extreme stress, not just for Thames Water, but for most water companies in the southeast of England. And we had to recover by doing things like having bottled water stations, and the event caused people to be out of water, and that's bad. And there was lots of investigations around what on earth was behind this, and whether or not we could do anything better in future events. So our regulator, Ofwat, produced a document called Out in the Cold, which suggested that we needed to do a lot more coordination and a lot more preparatory work. And SECLI-FIRM and a lot of conversations with the Met Office, etc., have developed our understanding to increase our capability over that time. So I'm majoring on this thing called freeze thaw, but this is just to say that our demand has an awful lot of weather-driven components. Some of it's to do with people using water, and some of it's to do with leaks on our network. So in the summertime, people use more water when it's sunny, or when it's hot, when it's dry, and then in these extreme conditions, their pipework can fail and cause freeze thaw. Our pipes can suffer winter bursts and summer bursts, either because it gets very cold or the ground gets very dry and moves. So in the bigger picture, there are many parts of the weather there's many climate services that are of interest to us in Thames Water. So into some detail. This graph down here, sorry, it's small, but it's there to give you an impression. These drop-offs here and here are Christmas. This is when people go away and demand shuts down at Christmas time. And there's an important point here. Lockdown really began in the UK just at the beginning of March 2020. That drop there that you can see here is because commercial demand shut down in London, and we saw a decrease in demand. So when these things closed, we saw a drop off in demand, but we also saw people being at home more during the summertime, and that caused this summer volatility in demand. We always get volatility in demand when it gets hot and dry, but this was amplified in lockdown. So that effect, that weather, became more important. And there's another spike at the tail end of this, which is this freeze-thaw event. This is the extreme cold followed by rapid warming, and it caused that kind of spike. I don't know whether you can see here, but it's hundreds of megalitres a day. So that's 100 million tons of water. Hang on, sorry, 1 million tons of water being lost every day because of this event. So we wanted to do something about that. We wanted to see it coming. Now, I won't dwell too heavily on this, but this is to reinforce the point that this cold weather event happened when lockdown was. There was another event in 2020, which was another freeze-thaw event, and that happened during lockdown. And so it happened. This is an animation showing that before lockdown, or when lockdown happened, demand in the centre of London, in this area here, dropped off quite dramatically because commercial premises closed down, and it rose in the suburbs because this is where people were locked down to mostly. They stopped commuting. London the centre of London kind of closed down a little bit. So we had this effect where commercial premises were shut, and if there was any problems in those commercial premises, it might have taken a long time for them to be noticed and fixed. So many more people were at home. So our climate services, John showed a very similar set of plots here, but there was a sort of a co-evolution of the design of the climate services that were provided in SECLI-FIRM, and we converged on a set of signals which allowed us to see this stress coming quite some time in advance. So there's two visuals here. So this is a type of visual that we would see from our climate services that was the most useful thing, and it showed us quite a long time in advance, a long time in our terms, 14 days prior to this event, that we could be facing this kind of stress that we saw in 2018. And that allowed us to proactively communicate. So we could do things like prepare water, increase our storage capability so we had more water for when the demand increased. But more importantly, I suppose, we could communicate to our customers to make sure that the impact of the freeze-thaw on them was minimised, and that had the knock-on effect that the impact of the freeze-thaw on them that impacted us was also minimised. So we produced some proactive communications in advance of the freeze-thaw itself, saying that this was a thing that was coming and our customers could do stuff. And specifically, if your business was shut down because of lockdown, please go and visit it. Please turn the heating on. Please do these things that could proactively protect your premises, which would protect the water resources situation, and we could match supply and demand more effectively. So that was a real success story of this kind of climate service. I'll leave this slide open, but there's a whole bunch of places where weather can actually improve our ability to manage our business in the short, medium, and long term. So that concludes my talk. I'll move. The last slide is just saying thank you for your time. If you have questions, please ask them. But I'll pause on this slide just to try and show the variety of ways in which climate services can help our business.
Yeah, thanks, John. It was a great talk and a really good slide to finish with. So does anyone have a question for John? Sorry, for Leo.
Or Ian.
Or Ian, yeah, Ian's hanging around somewhere. Or I mean, Ian, do you want to add something to what Leo said?
Yeah, just for everyone's information, yeah, the impact of rising demand for water is really amplified because the water treatment process is a biological process. So as such, it can't respond quickly to changes in demand. So the fact that if we can predict demand rises further ahead, it means that we can make smaller changes and prepare in a timely manner, so we're not shocking the biological process and potentially impacting water quality. So it really is useful to know, you know, the further we know in advance of the risk of higher demand, the more time we've got to prepare. And Leo's already shown one instance in the winter of 2020. We also had another success in the summer where we were from mid-May. We were predicting that at the end of May and into June, we were going to see a nice warm spell of weather and increased demand. And once again, it allowed us to slowly increase our production capability and storage to be prepared.
Okay.
Thank you.
Actually, there's a question in chat which is asking not about the successes, but about where things go wrong, where the forecast goes wrong. So this is a question from Andre. Do you have cases where you take action based on the forecast and it turns out to be wrong?
Yes, really pleased that's come along, and everybody recognises, similarly to the forecast of higher demand in early June, from towards the end of June into July, we were predicting a warm spell towards the end of July, which didn't materialise, and we kept predicting it at the end of July into August. And if anyone lives in the UK, everyone will know what a miserable wet summer we had. And the increase in demand didn't arrive until September. So we had a bit of a false alarm. But in a way, you know, I'd rather have a false alarm and be prepared and the demand increase doesn't come than to actually get a demand increase when we're not prepared. So, you know, we'll take that one on the chin. You know, there's not an immense cost in being prepared. But there's an immense cost of failing to customer supply.
Okay, that's an interesting point about false alarms, and maybe we'll come back to that in the panel. Now, there is one last question for you both from Dana, but actually I think I'm going to not ask that question now because I think it's about the effects of lockdown, and I think it's also relevant to the next presentation by National Grid. So we'll come back to your question in the panel discussion, Dana. So many thanks again to Leo and for Ian. So now let's turn, last but not least, back to energy, the National Grid, and a presentation by Daniel. Okay, yeah. Daniel Drew. So Daniel currently works in the modelling and insights team at National Grid ESO as a senior modelling specialist. His main role is to develop models to forecast and analyse the power system and market conditions. And prior to this, he worked as a postdoctoral researcher in the Department of Meteorology at the University of Reading, contributing to a number of energy meteorology projects. He's got a PhD in wind energy, an MSc in renewable energy, and a BSc in physics and meteorology. So Daniel, over to you. You want to go ahead and share your screen?
Thank you.
Yeah, that's all looking good. So yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. Yes, so today I was just hoping to talk about case study 8. So at National Grid ESO, we've been working with the Met Office, looking at how we can incorporate their seasonal forecast into some of the analysis that we do. So I will skip over my introduction
and move straight into an introduction on National Grid ESO and explain exactly what we do. So we are the system operator for electricity in Great Britain. So we don't generate electricity, we move it to where it's required. So generation happens, it's then fed into the transmission network, which is high voltage. It's moved around the country and then goes into low voltage and then shared out to the end user. And it's our job to do the bit in the middle. So making sure that there's enough generation on the transmission network to meet the demand put on at the other end in the distribution network. So it's really a question of balancing supply and demand every second of the day, all year, and our operations start from now in real time out to 30 years ahead, making sure we got all we need to make sure the system will be balanced. So why do we forecast? The biggest role is to make sure that the electricity on the system is enough to meet that demand and that it's not going to break any of the constraints on the network. So we've only got a certain infrastructure, only certain lines that can carry a certain amount of capacity. It's no use all the generation being in one place if we can't get it to where it's needed. So it's balancing supply and demand and making sure that the flows can get to where they need to. And we're trying to do this in the most economic manner possible. And so the earlier we can make decisions, the better. And we also have to make sure that we carry any reserve to deal with any faults or generation losses or demand increases. We provide all of our forecasts to market. They are published on 2 locations online, so you can track them all through a year and see how we adapt our forecasts. So today we're really focusing on our demand forecast. We forecast a range of we forecast the generation as well as the demand, but today it's really a question of focusing on the demand, and that's where the case study focused. There's a lot of drivers of demand variability. Weather is just one of them. A lot of them are human factors, such as human behaviour, which varies with time of year, day of week, school holidays, bank holidays. And then a big one, which was just mentioned in the previous talk, was the impact of COVID restrictions. It really changed people's relationships with electricity, and we saw huge suppression of demand. So in terms of the weather, the biggest drivers are the temperature. And so we use 2 temperature terms in our demand model. So the temperature for the last 4 hours and the temperature from previous days. So there is a lagged effect. If you have one single cold day, the impact on demand is very different to if you have 5 or 6 consecutive cold days. And so we would need to build that into our model. The other big factors are effective illumination. So this is just how much lighting you're going to need. Wind speed, people have a different relationship with temperature depending on the wind speed. And cooling power, which is a term we use which combines temperature and wind. So these are the weather variables that we want our forecast provider to give us, and we need them over all kinds of lead times. So from next few minutes right out to 30 years ahead. So obviously we use different meteorological data sets depending on the analysis that we're doing. In real time and out to 14 days, in fact, we use the output from numerical weather prediction models. And this is really where we're just doing the balancing supply and demand and making sure the flow can get to where it's needed. Beyond 2 weeks ahead, we switch to climatology. So we look at our historic weather, generate scenarios from our historic weather, and do our analysis based on those scenarios. And then we're looking at, do we need to build more lines or substations, new interconnectors? Can we design new markets to cope with how our demand and generation patterns are changing? So when we spoke to the Met Office, we were looking at this sort of boundary here between where we use our NWP and climatology. And rather than having that hard stop at 14 days, can we start to use some of the seasonal information on that boundary? And we focused on one example of, could we use the seasonal winter forecast in our winter demand peak forecast? So we have our highest demand in the winter when it's colder, so electricity use goes up massively. So this plot here shows a forecast for the winter. Again, on this you can see the reduction in electricity demand over Christmas. The grey lines there are various scenarios. So we take our historic weather data, we got 30 years of historic weather. We generate thousands of plausible winters based on that data and look at the demand for each of those. We also look at if we just had average weather, we call that the normal weather scenario, and we look at the ensemble mean. But none of this is informed by a forecast. This is just all generated from the history. So this is the peak demand for each day during the winter. And so we were wondering, with the Met Office, could we set up a process where we incorporated the seasonal forecast into our winter forecast analysis? So I should emphasize that the aim of the case study wasn't really to look at the skill or evaluate whether we did better or worse using this forecast. It was really, can we just set up that pipeline of getting the data from the Met Office and putting it into our forecast product, so we can use this for many years ahead and eventually see that average skill come out. So the Met Office seasonal forecasts, we took the temperature and wind speed from the glossy 5, which has some skill in seasonal means. So we focused on the DJF from the forecast produced in November. Our demand forecast product has sub-daily weather data in it. We need to know the temperature and wind speed throughout the day if we're going to forecast this winter peak. And so that was one obstacle that we had to address almost immediately, because that doesn't align with the output of the seasonal forecast. So as our experimental example, we looked at, could we shift the distribution from which we were sampling from? So we have our historic climatology. So the one on the left here is our effective temperature at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. And the one on the right is the wind speed for the same period. So the grey is the distribution that we were originally sampling from, and the red is the shifted distribution based on a seasonal forecast provided by the Met Office, which had a clear NAO positive signal, which moved the temperature distribution up and increased the mean wind speed slightly. So we were able to set up this pipeline where from the Met Office seasonal forecast provided us with the exact data that our forecast already used. So we didn't have to change anything on our side. It was just directly fed into our current process, which really helped with the project, because it's not easy to change products from our end. Once we've got them developed, it's very hard to find the time, manpower, and the access to get back into the code and make the changes. So having that data in the exact format was absolutely crucial. What we actually found from that first example was that we have to run a load of scenarios for the winter based on the COVID restrictions, whether it's going to be a strong lockdown or no lockdown. And that led us to a big range in our winter peak forecast. in comparison, the variation by introducing the information in the weather forecast is relatively small. So it was about 7 times as large for the COVID restrictions as it is for the seasonal forecast. The biggest limitation we found was that we absolutely rely on sub-daily weather. We need to know what the temperature is going to be doing for our peak, which is at sort of 7 o'clock in the evening. We need to know what the temperature is doing during the afternoon. So having that sub-daily weather with the wind and temperature coherent is vital for our modelling, and we didn't have that at this stage. The other obstacle is the big output from our winter peak forecast is a document we produce, which is coming out in the next couple of weeks, in fact, called the Winter Outlook. And we have to start the work on that in September, absolute latest October. And the seasonal forecast product we were using is from November. So there's clearly a mismatch between what we publish and when the forecast comes out. We're hoping to address all of these points as we move on. The important thing from our end was that we were able to bring in the data from the Met Office. We were able to put it in our process, and it worked. Whether the numbers were beneficial for us, we haven't evaluated at this stage, but we've got time to start doing that over the next few years. So to summarize, previously we've had a heavy reliance on sampling climatology for our forecast beyond 14 days. But we are exploring the possibility for incorporating seasonal information into our forecast, particularly for winter peaks. So at that point, I think I'll leave it there and happy to take questions.
Okay, many thanks, Daniel, and I think that's a really nice example of the, I mean, sometimes the relatively slow pace of development of climate services, but you've been addressing the kind of very practical aspects, kind of first of all in terms of getting the data and information into your system. So that's kind of very nice to hear. And maybe just come back to Dana's question. I mean, you mentioned briefly about COVID, Daniel, but do you see COVID having sort of longer term implications for National Grid strategy or planning or?
Yes, very much so. The huge unknown of whether there will be, we're forecasting years out, and so whether there's going to be any restrictions over the next winter or the winter after that, we just got to run scenarios of different levels of COVID restrictions. What is good is we've now starting to get a data set of how people's behaviour correspond to those restriction levels. So we have seen a slight change in the demand behaviour, but as it's been gradual, we've been able to see that in the data sets.
Okay, so yeah, I mean, I guess these is the kind of uncertainties aren't only in our climate and seasonal forecasts and projections and predictions, but also in the sort of societal and economic aspects. So yeah. So any other questions directly to Daniel now? Okay, if not, then thanks to Daniel. Thanks to all the other panelists, and we'll kind of open up now to a sort of broader discussion. But actually, I'd just like to come back to a couple of things in the chat, and Andre's question about false alarms. Marco, you wrote a kind of interesting response to Andre's question. Do you want to come online and kind of elaborate a bit more on your response? Are you able to unmute, Marco? Is Marco still with us?
Okay, sorry, I had some problems with my mic. So can you hear me?
Yes, you're a little bit quiet, but yeah, go ahead.
No, just to clarify. So when you take a decision like this in the industry, you have a lot of variables to take in account. So fortunately, you do not rely solely to the forecast as black and white. So, and also sometimes, quite often, the market situation overcomes the forecast. So you can take a decision contrary to what you see on your seasonal forecast because the market conditions force you to do such way. And of course, in any case, when you take a decision, you have to make a B plan because you know that 90% of the time your forecasts are wrong, as well as for economics. There is no one econometric model that work, no one. So you never take a forecast as a truth. So the real problem is to, to hedge the risk. So you trust in a scenario because you need a scenario, but you must to mitigate your scenario. So do not trust on it too much. And last winter, we have a striking example of a very badly wrong weather forecast over Asia, where many seasonal forecast models, or maybe all of the most famous, were predicting a warm season over Siberia, and so over Asia, and they were predicting basically a weak high Siberian system, and they completely made wrong because we had a very strong Siberian high and very cold weather in Asia, so the gas market get mad. And so this is a case where if you were following only seasonal forecasts as they eat, you were taking a very bad situation. So but this is true also for other models. So anytime that you use a model, you have to be really careful. I hope that I answered to the question, but
yeah. I mean, I guess one thing that you have with the seasonal forecast is some information from the seasonal forecast hindcast about the performance of the modeling system, the skill or the quality of the forecast. Do you just want to comment from your perspective how you use that information?
yes. So just a consideration. So usually, at least in our corporation, we tend to have an approach that is deterministic. I know that is not the best way, but when you have in a trading room, you need to take a decision that is buy, sell, or nothing. So at the very end, there is a person that must to take a deterministic decision. And you cannot avoid a deterministic scenario. So you can use a probabilistic approach. Is what we are going to do. But at the very end, you have to make a, let's say, basic scenario. About the seasonal forecast models, I guess that, so my impression is that interesting tools, they are quite a novelty in the market world, or at least in the power utility world. They have a good skill in tropics, as you know. In the middle altitude, honestly, the results are still not so well. So the main outcome is that they are able to predict the right sign of your variable with a very, very small amplitude that they have no effect on the portfolio management. So at least our corporation has been insensitive to the signal's amplitude. So our impression is that maybe seasonal forecast need still strong effort on basic research, and so they need, I guess, a strong effort by, I would say, policymaker on funding or public research, because it seems that we still need but the people from World Package 2 can confirm or not. So we still need a lot of research, scientific research, because it's difficult. It's a difficult problem. So when you see something like the last winter that completely missed the Siberian high, that is quite big player. So something we lose something on physical aspect that we need to understand. I don't know. So they're interesting. They are also interesting because they are physical models, so you can understand what is wrong when it's wrong. Something that you cannot do with neural networks. So this is an important aspect. So I guess that it's a promising sector. So this is why many corporations like us also they're important counterparts like EDF, and so on are involved quite strongly on seasonal models because we need to understand these tools and also to get ready when the advance on science of seasonal forecast model will improve the skills, and so as corporation we will be ready to use properly because we already learned the instrument.
Thanks very much, Marco. Would anyone else on the panel like just to comment on this issue about combining seasonal forecast information with other information that your organization uses for decision making? And perhaps this question about probabilistic versus deterministic forecast and decision making.
I'll just make a comment on perhaps something that's linked to several of those topics.
Yeah.
It's not just whether it's right or wrong, it's whether it's consistent as well. Because you could have, if you've got inconsistency in the forecast product, that causes more confusion than whether necessarily it's right or wrong. So that's the other thing that we're looking for. We haven't talked much about it, but it's pretty critical.
Can you just explain what you mean by consistency?
Well, in the forecast horizon plots that we were using with the climate service of the forecast product, you could see whether or not there was over or under forecast in terms of the exceedance, so over exceeding your climatology or not exceeding your climatology. If that varies on a day-to-day basis, or if your forecast comes out every couple of days and it's different from the previous one, then that undermines confidence in the end users as well. So it's an important part that has to come into the evaluation.
Okay, so that's consistency over different lead times where you've got constantly sort of refreshed forecasts.
Yeah.
Okay, and I guess that leads on to the sort of question about the timeliness of the forecast, that the information has to be received at the right point in the sort of decision making cycle, if you like. Otherwise, it's well, essentially useless. However good the forecast, but if the information is delivered at the right time, then I think there were some quite nice examples came out from the case studies of how it can help to make earlier and kind of better decisions. And I mean, one of the questions in Joe's questionnaire that he talked about kind of related to the timeliness of the information. So would anyone like to comment on that? The importance of getting the information at the right time?
Yeah, it's Ian speaking. Yeah, yes, Claire. So as we've gone through the process, we've actually we've come to the fact that we need this information, and we're currently getting the forecast twice a week. You know, and that sort of builds confidence. So the first time a change in the risk appears, then it puts a flag up that we need to monitor closely. So that we can then pay more attention and try and understand the reasons for the change and start the process going. You know, as we get closer to the event, you know, we know our time to start responding, and as the signal gets stronger or weaker, we can make decisions based on that.
Okay. Would anyone else like to comment on the timing of information?
It's Leo. I'd like to add that there's kind of a partnership between the client and the service provider. Some pieces of information can be given with more confidence at certain periods, and making that clear. The climatologists kind of understand these things around. It's easier to say, what the winter might be like in December, January than it is in November, for instance, or working out what the demand, what the weather might do in today and tomorrow, suddenly locks into place after certain cycles of the ingest of observed weather parameters. So there are really good times to take an output from these systems, and they can kind of vary in confidence, either across the day for these short-term forecasts or across the year for other ones. But it's well worth surfacing that and just being very, very, very open and candid about how the skill kind of modulates across the various times, so that the consumer can choose this compromise, because they always want the best, but they won't necessarily, but they want it early too. And those two things don't sit very well together often. So finding that compromise and finding that partnership is really important, I think.
Okay, but what you're talking about implies, I mean, quite a lot of time and effort on both sides. So I mean, it sounds quite different to a climate service where a load of information is kind of, well, it's a bit harsh, but dumped on a web portal somewhere. So I think, are you saying that it's the kind of expertise of the providers and developing that dialogue, that understanding, the communication, trying to understand better maybe some of the physical processes that are important to you, give you more confidence?
If that luxury can be given, then yes. So Joe spoke about this, about the different kinds of services you can give, and whether it's just here's the answer, or here's the answer with some decoration and explanation, or here's a two-way conversation about what your needs are and what can be provided by the climate services. So just to illustrate, we as Thames naively presumed that there was a certain set of data that we could get from the Met Office at one stage. And in deepening that conversation, it becomes apparent there's a whole stack of stuff which is actually much more valuable to our world than the things we saw on the shop window, effectively. And you only get that through a dialogue. So I think under certain circumstances, a conversation is really valuable, yes.
Okay, and would other panel members like to comment on the importance of this? I mean, I guess it goes beyond, it's sort of supporting information, but maybe goes a bit beyond this kind of guidance and this dialogue, particularly as industry is kind of learning to use seasonal forecasts. How important do you think these things are? Does someone like to comment?
Yes, Claire. You know, we're already saying, we've already, you know, pointed out a couple of instances where it's proved positive results. And I think you're right. There's a lot of work on each side. So when we receive a risk assessment with regards to from our Met Office, the provider, there's as much work to be done in interpreting that data that's given to us, because they base their forecast on temperature, on rainfall, on sun hours, on, you know, but they don't know the current environment. So we've talked about lockdown. We haven't talked about holiday periods. We haven't talked about bank holidays. We haven't talked about the current environment. How long has it been dry? You know, there's a lot of things to be, you know, there's a lot of work to be done on each side. So it's a fine line on about how much information's passed each way. So you need just enough information. Otherwise, you can go into information overload, and the system and the whole decision process just gets clouded. So it's important to get the amount and the right information both right.
Okay, and I guess that probably applies to a number of the case studies. I mean, from the chat following Valentina's presentation was kind of very much about, you know, the sort of non-rainfall kind of factors that affect hydropower management, what's happening upstream, what happened the previous winter are all things to consider. And Marco gave some nice examples of having to consider wider market conditions and so on. So does anyone else want to come in more on this?
I've got one point, Claire, just to pick up on something that Leo said a little while ago, if I can come in, if I may, just on just on the issue. You mentioned some naivety on their side. I think there's also naivety on the side of the provider, in this case, I guess the Met Office as well, in that we sometimes discard sort of some of our as a provider of data and services, we discard some of that sometimes as not being relevant, but that's through maybe not completely understanding user needs all the time. And actually, sometimes we can think a little bit too quantitatively perhaps, and sometimes there are some of those more qualitative aspects of a forecast that might be more interesting or more valuable to Thames Water, and actually sometimes maybe we're a bit too ready to discard that. But I think that's particularly through the Thames Water kind of partnership and that experience, it's been useful knowing what bits of a forecast are valuable and how to frame it around that, rather than just launching data and turning that into a visualization. So I think, it's been a good process and a nice learning process to go through, I think, from our perspective as well.
Okay, yeah. I mean, that kind of leads on to, something I was going to ask about. One of the original aims of SECLI-FIRM was to try and look at the economic value of climate services, and we do have some examples of that. Marco mentioned the performance indicators. The Met Office has also done some work in some of the case studies with this relative economic value metric, but perhaps this was more challenging than we kind of anticipated for a number of different reasons. But I think one thing that did come out in a number of the case studies, and in partly through the evaluation process, Joe, that you led, is the practical value. So, maybe Joe, do you want to comment first on this difference between economic value and practical value, and then see if other people would like to comment on this?
Yeah, I think economic value is using some kind of method, and a sort of, I think we use a number of sort of established economic theory in our economic assessment to try to assign some kind of value to the services that were being developed, which was far more complicated in some situations than others. So Dan, when he was talking about the national grid winter outlook, that's very difficult to quantify because there are a number of stakeholders that benefit from that outlook, and that's quite a difficult thing to quantify, for example. But that was one aspect of it which was very valuable because it gives you an idea of the economic value, which you can then communicate to wider organizations and perhaps even map onto other sectors as well. So that's really valuable. But I think, as I've mentioned, we really wanted to focus a lot of our evaluation more around kind of the practical side of things, like how people are interacting with a service on a fundamental level, whether people are actually using it as actively as we had proposed them to use it for, whether it was actually being used day by day, even on the timescales of weeks, for example, whether it's being used to make crucial decisions. So that's what we really wanted to understand. And if the answers to some of those questions were no, it isn't being used as often as we envisaged, then why isn't it being used as often as that, and what can we do to address that? Because obviously that identifies some sort of gap which we need to kind of overcome somehow. So that was where we focused our evaluation, and hopefully some of the panelists here might be able to comment on this, but hopefully they found that aspect of it useful.
Yeah, and that sort of comes back to a question I recall from the chat I can't find, but it was about, okay, here we go. This was a question from Dana. What metrics do you use to measure the success of the uptake of the service? And I guess we're saying it's kind of complicated. It's not just a case of counting clicks on a website, but you can consider these two components: the economic benefits and the practical value. So maybe would others on the panel like to comment on this?
Yes, Claire, it's Ian speaking. One of the apart from production capability and having enough water available for the customers, one of our other key metrics is planning maintenance works and the cost of cancelling maintenance work due to increased demand. So the fact that we've got the forecast now sub-seasonal, sort of 4-6 weeks ahead, if we can cancel an outage because we believe we're going to have too high demand more than 2 weeks in advance, then there's minimal cost. You know, you haven't deployed cranes and people and mobilized and done road closures and lots of expensive operations. If we can cancel more than 2 weeks in advance, we save quite a bit of money in deferred costs. So that's one way that we've been that we will be measuring going forward. We know how many jobs we've cancelled over the past 5 years, and we'll be looking to see if that improves due to subseasonal forecasting.
Okay. Anyone else from the panel want to comment about economic and practical value?
I can just add a couple of things.
Yeah, Daniel.
So as mentioned, ours is quite a unique case in that we provide the forecast, and the economic value is really to the people that then use the forecast, so all of the stakeholders. So that's why in our particular case study, to assign an economic value, you really had to talk to the people that were picking up the forecast that we provided. Internally, the big benefit for us was, well, how did we measure? How did we evaluate it? Could we get the data in from the Met Office? Did it feed into our forecast product? Did the output of our forecast fit with the description provided by the Met Office? So NAO positive, warmer, windier. Does our demand value fit with that? That's as far as we were able to go. And then engagement with the stakeholders of using that forecast is how we would assign the economic value. It's very difficult to assign an economic value to us.
Okay, but I guess there's also your sort of reputational value as a provider of information to others.
Yes, indeed. We are incentivized to make that forecast as good as possible, and we want to make that forecast as good as possible. Yeah.
Okay. Anyone else want to come in on this topic?
I can add something about hydropower plants production and management of the production in a long period, because if we have, for example, it's often we need to have extraordinary maintenance of our plants, and if we have a better forecast of and the provisional of the water availability in the future, we can have also a better management of these extraordinary works that we need. And it means for us a possible gain and of a larger production in the long period.
Okay, yeah. So maintenance is actually important for a number of the case studies, and perhaps in your case would be kind of an extension of the types of decision making. I mean, yeah. Thanks, Valentina and John. I mean, I guess the Shell case study was one where it was possible to make some sort of estimates of well, essentially cost savings. You talked about quite surprisingly high cost of hiring vessels. I'm sure most of us were quite surprised by that. But even having those estimates of economic value, do you think it's the practical value or the economic value that's actually most important for Shell?
Well, the straightforward cost benefit of being able to secure a vessel early because you've got better forecast information is a huge advantage. The first case study that we tested this on was a rig move. So it was taking one of the floating rigs that was moving to a different location. And when you approach the end of a drilling program, you might need to make decisions that have a significant impact on the duration of the job. So you might say, well, we want to do a sidetrack well, that's going to take 3 months. Do we have the weather window to start that? Yes or no? If you do, and you start that, that's a pretty major commitment. If you don't, then you just abandon the well and you come back next year. And the project that we were mirroring the product on in August, the shallow southern North Sea site, was a fairly significant undertaking to lay an electrical cable to a platform. And that's something that needed a good forecast horizon in shallow water. So yeah, both the cost and the safety benefits are pretty significant there. The one thing from an economic evaluation that we found out was that it's difficult to untangle sometimes the non-weather elements. So although we can look at supply and demand of vessels based on the forecast, there are other things going on, such as vessel owners taking fleets out to other parts of the world where it's busier, and we have no control over that and no visibility of that either. So it's quite a complex calculation to get to the bottom of.
Okay, great. So and to the audience, are there any sort of final questions for our panel members? Either write in chat or raise a hand if you want to ask a question. Okay, I guess everyone's ready for a break. Any last comments from the panel members? Okay, well, thanks for a great kind of discussion, some really good presentations. Okay, somebody applauding. Yeah, I'll sure join everyone in applauding our panel members and Joe for his presentation earlier. So I think I'll just hand back to our hosts, and they'll explain the break and when we're going to come back for our last practical groups. So yeah, thanks all.